the New York Times, or others who cover international events, is that they tend to focus a lot on what government officials say. So the reporting that you get about Afghanistan and Iraq is disproportionately about statements from President Obama and General Petreaus, and not necessarily independent kind of reporting. So a good portion of media and news reports is nothing more than a distilled version of what you get from higher political kind of officials. And the media tends to report, I think, only the most severe kinds of failures that occur in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think they miss most of the small signs of progress. Because the kind of things I said I would look at and said you should consider as signs of success tend to be things that aren't big dramatic events and don't change a lot day to day. They're not the kind of things that are going to show up in news reports. And in fact, there is significant progress on many of them in Afghanistan and Iraq. But you won't see the kind of news reports that take a look at the small, incremental, over time improvements that occur. What you get from the news media at best is nice indicators of big failures. Those are important, but I think they tend to miss the other good stuff. Another possibility that I would consider is relying on the reports of non-governmental organizations. It could be in the human rights area, an organization like Amnesty International. It could be on private humanitarian relief agencies that operate in those countries. These are vital efforts that take place by those non-governmental organizations. They obviously have the advantage of not necessarily having national or country interests or an incentive to spin quite as much as political officials in Washington or at the UN. So in many ways, if you have testimony from Amnesty International that there's not much evidence of torture, that human rights conditions have improved, you ought to take those kind of things seriously. They're relatively unbiased. I didn't say completely unbiased, but relatively. The problem, of course, with relying on those kind of sources is first is they tend to be rather myopic. They see only their one piece of the situation, be it in the human rights or other kinds of efforts improving the standards of living, and I think kind of lack the big picture. If you rely on non-governmental organizations, you have to collect the pieces yourself and put them together. And second, I think many times what we find with non-governmental organizations is they issue reports sometimes years later that reflect conditions that, now they report in 2011 that reflect conditions that took place 3 or 4 years ago, which is often not a good basis for making the kinds of decisions and judgments that we all have to make as citizens, nor is it always useful to the policymakers who have to make those particular kinds of decisions. So in some ways it's not as easy as we would like, but in some ways I think that's a good thing, because making snap kind of judgments that the mission's been accomplished, that Iraq is a complete success or a complete failure, is probably far too kinds of simplistic. It may be more personally satisfying to make those kind of judgments. You may feel better about yourself, particularly if you make judgments that fit your own political ideology, whether that's on the left or the right. But that's probably not the best way to go about thinking about these kinds of situations. So where do we stand? Is the world in Afghanistan and Iraq are a lot grayer. Were you to apply the kind of standards and how we know, I think you would find both causes for optimism in both places as well as serious causes for kind of concern.